All right, so in yesterday's video, I was introducing this notion of transitional space and saying that in the ability to enlarge the surface area of transitional space in your life with, in a sense, the fantasized objective of making the whole world not your oyster, but your transitional space. Okay, your potential container of interstices that are themselves gates into transitional space lies better freedom, better individuation. In fact, that's probably one of the key indicators of individuation. One thing that you will notice is that people that we can probably claim are modern examples of individuated beings, such as, for example, some enlightened Buddhist monks. I think that's a good example. But you have examples among people who are spiritual, but not in a Buddhist way. They can be Christian, they can be Jewish, they can be Muslim, they can be Hindu. You can also have examples among people that are not, strictly speaking, spiritual or religious, of course. But I think the example of the enlightened Buddhists are very good, because you'll often notice when they communicate, when they speak, if they give a lecture, first of all, they very often have a smile on their face, and they're very quick to laugh in a way. And what this tells us is that they are in transitional space. They are in this space which is poised between the suspension of belief, but also the suspension of disbelief. So in other words, they are able to remain adapted to the external world. It's true that in the Buddhist case, this adaptation is kind of restricted, but nevertheless, it is a form of adaptation. And we could argue that all forms of adaptation ultimately are going to be confined to a particular mode of life. You know, I can be adapted as a Frenchman in the south of France who is pursuing training in psychoanalysis and working in an administration. Would I be super adapted immediately to like rural Japan, or to, I don't know, like the mountains of Chile, life in the mountains of Chile? I really very much doubt it. So all forms of adaptation are, to some great extent, localized and partial. But there's nevertheless adaptation in the case of these enlightened monks. But there's also this idea that they have let go on so many attachments that they're able also to suspend disbelief, and that they seem to be constantly inhabiting, or mostly inhabiting, a kind of transitional space, which is, as I said in the previous video, is also a space of play, which brings joy, because that's what it brings. Play brings joy. Transitional space brings a certain sense of playfulness and elation, okay? A sense of freedom. Freedom is also a good way to put it. And what I want to say in this video is that there is a link between your type and what are the modalities to be able to access transitional space more often than maybe you can until now. Another way of putting it is how to make a larger part of your world a kind of gate to transitional space. Okay? Now, if you want to know more, stick to this video. Don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. I actually have made a video called a Deep Dive on Transitional Space on Patreon, I think last week. If you want to check it out, as well as the whole library of deep dive videos that I have made that are usually 20 to 30 minutes on a topic of the patron's choice, you can become a Patreon supporter. The first link in the description box below is to my Patreon. I need your support more than ever to continue with this, and I could not do this without you, so please consider supporting me. It's not expensive, it's pretty cheap for all the quality content that you get, and you also get access to our community on Discord to hang out with me and the others there on a daily basis. So it's a good time, you should join. Okay, so taking the example of the NI dominant, so how does an NI dominant access more interstices, access more transitional space? Well, to understand why the dominant function particularly is important, because it is the dominant function that gives a world, right? So it is also the function that will regulate the way in which this world that it gives opens up gates to transitional space. And what I want to say here is that there is a deep connection, very deep connection, between the playfulness of transitional space and our fundamental fantasies. Because if you like, in a sense, to be able to live in transitional space, at least for certain periods of time, is to be able to express your core fantasy with PH, as you understand, which can be interpreted as the core narrative of your personality. The core way in which your personality expresses itself is via core fantasy, which in the case of an dominance, we're using this example here, is a fantasy of repair. Okay, at least that's been my hypothesis. So the fantasy of repair is constitutive of the NI-dominant personality, whether INFJ, which is INFJ personality is also underpinned by an auxiliary, if you want to call it auxiliary, supportive fantasy of emotional mirroring. That would be the FE core fantasy. In the case of the INTJ, we have more something like a fantasy of control and mastery, which would be the TE fantasy. Nevertheless, and that's what makes the types look quite different, even though underlying it is really the same fantasy of repair. So to be able to access these interstices into transitional space, the idea would be that you are able to live your fantasy in a way that is playful, in a way that is imaginative, in a way that, in a sense, doesn't take itself too seriously, does not preoccupy itself too much with notions of having to finish a project or having to sort of project yourself into the future, even though that is always a temptation. There's also a fantasy of divination and anti-dominance that I've talked about. But trying to live in the present moment of the pure enjoyment of your fantasy structure. So in the case of repair, to give you a concrete example, it would be something like having a conversation with colleagues. I like to use this example. And you're having a conversation where, jokes are said, maybe there are some disagreements, but you're able to look at the situation as reparative for you and them. But not reparative in the sense of like, okay, so I need to create this template of how step one is now, and in like a few months, I have to project myself to this long-term vision of how I'm going to heal them. No, it's like to consider that in its enjoyment and playfulness, and in a sense, its levity, there's repair. So it's almost a sense of realizing that your fantasy can meet with an adaptive reality that is deeply healing in and of itself, even if it's in the present moment. So it's like you're having this conversation, you're enjoying it. Maybe at some points you might have reasons to be a little bit offended, or you might offend without meaning to, but you're able to keep this levity of mood because you're experiencing the joy of assimilating the situation to repair. Repair is happening, and you don't need a huge gate onto it, right? As soon as someone is smiling, as soon as someone is cracking a joke, as soon as someone is telling you something that you didn't know about them, as soon as someone trusts you with something that you hadn't, maybe they've not told someone else, as soon as someone is thankful for something you might say, even if these are just little comments that might be forgotten quickly, you're already in the space of repair, and you can make this a transitional space. So it's almost a sense of bringing the pressure or fantasy down to the present moment, and instead of channeling something very serious and very long-term, which is also needed for meaningfulness, can also just let itself roll. You're aware that you're supported by this fantasy structure, but you let itself sort of play itself out through you with others. And that's a way of expressing the transitional space through the NI fantasy. Guys, give me a like if you enjoyed this video. You know that I need better referencing because YouTube's algorithm has changed recently and it's been impacting my views. So thank you so much. It costs you nothing to give me a like. And of course, for my 2 books on the INFJ, you can get both of them. The Infinite Soul, my latest one on the INFJ in the modern world, which is in fact, without saying it, a lot about the transitional space of INFJs and how to find meaning, purpose, and value as an INFJs in a world that we otherwise sometimes find quite hostile. And it's pretty cool. The Ecstatic Soul also linked below, which is all about the INFJ's internal life, thoughts, beliefs, and the nature of INFJ consciousness. It's a goodie. If you want a deep understanding of this beautiful type, definitely get both books. Thank you so much, guys. and see you tomorrow.